I'm not saying this is easy, nor am I saying the solutions can be had in the next 2 years, but it's about putting the building blocks in place so that over time, the policies can adjust with the macros, with more digitalization. What are you going to do with the rise of all these loans, with the rise of alternative assets? Because with less trust in the banking system, people might run to crypto. So then how are you going to regulate that? You have to see the entire system. You have to see the entire trauma within, not just the band-aids of why are people doing online gambling? Maybe because they don't feel secure and they don't have enough money. Maybe they don't have enough money to even pay for basic stuff.
Welcome to Brave. Learn from Southeast Asia's best tech leaders. Build the future, learn from our past, and stay human in between. No BS on success. I'm Jeremy Au, venture capitalist, serial founder, Harvard MBA, science fiction nerd, and dad of 2 daughters. Every week, we debate startup news, interview changemakers, answer listener questions, and share personal insights. Join our movement of over 40,000 members and get transcripts, resources, and community at www.bravesea.com. Stay well and stay brave. You don't want to miss Geeks on a Beach, the unique premier startup conference in the region. Join us from November 13th to 15, 2024 at J Park Island Resort in Mactan, Cebu. This event brings together tech enthusiasts, investors, and entrepreneurs for 3 days of workshops, talks, and networking. Register at geeksonabeach.com and use code BRAVEC for a 45% discount for the first 10 registrations and 35% off for the next ones. Hey, Gita, how are you?
Hi, I'm good. How are you doing?
Oh, it's good to see you. I know it's been a busy news week in Indonesia month. I think we had the Pope just visit as well. How was that?
It was great. It was a very positive news in our country because it showed how the country is celebrating tolerance and diversity in religion. So overall, it was a very positive news story.
Wow. Yeah. I think it was just nice. He also visited Singapore afterwards, and it was a big event and lots of people went. So I think it's apparently like the first time he's really traveled the Asia Pacific for a very long chunk of time. And I mean, obviously for traveling from Italy, it's a long flight and he's getting older as well.
Yeah. And I think what we focused on internally is how simple he was when he visited, as in he didn't lavish himself in luxury watches or anything like that. He actually was very humble and simple. I mean, he literally had the entire movement globally. Here he is, not even riding in an Alfred car, which is considered the most expensive car in our country, not wearing lavish watches and all of these things. And he's just here in a humble manner, riding in a normal car and just reaching out to his people. And that was the big theme.
Yeah. I think that at the end of the day, when you are not well off, people have a certain conception of what being rich is. When you become rich, then those are the conspicuous consumption that kicks in, like handbags and other stuff. And then the joke is that the rich who are truly rich know how to be rich, which is to look poor because you need to avoid taxation and, public criticism all the time. And I think that's something that I always remember for China. I was there during the bull days, right? And people were like, oh, why are the Chinese like this? And I'm like, well, they are still learning how to be rich. Now with obviously the big kind of like government push to redistribute wealth from the rich to the middle class, it's a big learning where I think everybody has stopped conspicuous consumption in China. So I think it's a common issue.
Yeah, but overall, I thought it was a positive news and it went on quite seamlessly because there was also a lot of notices from offices, including my office, by the way, to work from home because there might be 100,000 people going to the mass that the Pope was holding. So everyone just took their time and worked from home and ensured that the traffic wasn't as crazy as it could be. And as anyone who has ever gone to Jakarta knows, the traffic can be insane. So it was really nice for people to recognize that there's a large public figure here because unfortunately so much of the news has been on religious intolerance and the way people have politicized religion just for their own benefit. And so it shouldn't have been a situation where people were worried if something could happen. It was really great that in general, collectively, people were really excited, including people of different religions. They were really excited to have a pope come and visit Indonesia. That was a very big deal. In fact, all of our government leaders and business leaders even came and visited and said hello and was just so touched that he visited Indonesia.
Yeah, I think it's amazing to see that interfaith or religious tolerance really kind of be exhibited. I think everybody
Yeah.
was very nice. And I mean, come on, 2024 plus plus, right?
Right.
Let's be chill
Right.
and let's hang out and let's be friends and try to help poor people and move on with life.
Basic
Yeah.
stuff, we fight about basic stuff.
And you know what? The basic stuff we were talking about as well was, I think, the middle class statistics that came out recently, right? It was a big debate that we were having, which is about the Department for Economic Statistics basically shared that the Indonesian middle class is shrinking from their perspective. They said that, hey, the number of people who are categorized as middle class used to be about 57 million out of a total population of around 270 to 290. And then this has dropped down to about kind of 48 million. So about 4% drop in the percentage. Obviously, a slightly bigger denominator as well. And they define the middle class as those having a per capita expenditure of between 2 to 10 million rupiah per month, which is about 3 to 17 times the World Bank's poverty line. So yeah, what are your thoughts, Gita?
That's been big news here. We've talked about it informally and also formally in various situations. First of all, my gut instinct was to go, yeah, that sounds right. But if I have to take a step back, I also have to take a look at how do you define middle class? And how you define middle class also depends on the context of that country. When you said it is based on per capita expenditure, okay, yes, but per capita expenditure doesn't necessarily correlate highly with how much income they're making, GDP per capita, and also not just GDP per capita, but what is their savings rate? What are their typical expenditure for basic needs? And those are the things that I think if you're in countries where it doesn't have a strong support system for certain basic needs, you're going to have that easier slide from middle class to lower class because if there's any shocks to the system, so for example, a health crisis or financial crisis, aka the pandemic and the current economic issues, then yes, they will be less likely to survive. So I think although my initial instinct is to say, yeah, that sounds about right, we need to also go back and ensure that everyone's talking on the same page in terms of how do you even define middle class? And should we challenge that definition of middle class? Should it be, for example, based on GDP per capita, or should it be GDP per capita plus savings plus expenditure on non basic needs? What are the necessary definitions needed for a country like Indonesia, for a context like Indonesia?
Yeah, I think that's the permission for the economist nerd in me to come out. But yeah, I think
Yes.
I agree with you. There's a definition piece, and then obviously there's a directional and policy piece, right? So I think on the definitional piece, it's always hard to be apples to apples. Even GDP per capita is highly contested, which is about the amount of production. So Singapore has an equivalent GDP per capita as the United States, in higher than that of United Kingdom, which was used to be the former, I guess, colony supervisor. I don't know how to describe it these days, but it's an inversion there. But of course, I think people have shared that both London and Singapore serve as headquarters for multinational corporations. So a lot of production is getting recognized. Is that the right thing? So then if you flip it the other way around, you look at expenditure per capita. Singapore has lower expenditure per capita than the United States. But now, of course, you can, like I said, argue the other way around. The United States actually has a much lower savings rate. In Singapore, households are being forced to save by the government, which saves their own accounts. And then, of course, the United States is a lot more debt, right? That's a little bit of a definitional piece where it's like production or income per capita is not the right measure all the time, but neither is expenditure per capita. So there's always a definitional piece. But I guess, Gita, how do you feel about the direction of the middle class in Indonesia?
By the way, you totally scratched this itch of mine that one day I want to be an economist, but I'll probably never get there because I just won't go back to school for it. Anyway, one of the things that I realized too, right, as you said that, is that there was recently a study showing that almost half of Americans have $500 or less in their savings. Because you're right, because expenditure doesn't also always reflect other ways that they manage money, right? For example, what is their savings rate? What is their ability to withstand shocks? Those are the things that make up the stability of certain social classes. So I think for the middle class, it is going to be very tough if you're already on the cusp to maintain that status if there are shocks to the system. If I'm looking ahead, now this is really a lot of responsibility and also opportunity for the new cabinet to create supportive policies for different areas of society that may be more vulnerable to these shocks. So the very common one we see is middle class. And then there's actually lots more. There are children because everything starts from the baseline of basic needs, nutrition, like healthcare. And those are the things that if we don't invest into them, knowing full well that the benefit might not be seen for maybe 10 years, or more, then we might lose out on this rush towards a high income country or this rush towards Indonesia goal 2045 when we become a high income country, because you would need people for that. So we're talking about hundreds of millions of people who might miss out on this opportunity simply because, for example, their nutrition wasn't taken care of, or they didn't have equitable access to healthcare or basic education. So it's just very basic stuff. This is an area of opportunity for the new cabinet to ensure that you don't put more and more people into very precarious position. And that is why, just like what you said, it's not always about GDP per capita, because you could have a higher GDP per capita and less savings, higher debt. You could also have a higher GDP, but actually not necessarily higher GDP per capita for a certain segment of society, right? You might end up having very large inequality that could lead to societal shocks in other ways in the future. Basically, it's a lot of homework.
No, I mean, it goes back to it, which is like the government has a responsibility to, if they do take out debt or whatever it is, at the end of the day, it's like, are you investing in pro growth economic policies that grow the middle class and take more people out of poverty and
Yeah.
give them better opportunities and let them believe that there's a future that's better for their kids than the life they have for them right now. So when we talk about the middle class, beyond the definitional piece, how do you feel about the Indonesian middle class? What are the issues? Are they shrinking? Are they growing? How do you really think about it?
Yeah, I do believe they might be shrinking. Even if I talk about definitions earlier on, I do
Mm.
believe they might be shrinking because we have had a lot of large external shocks. And again, when you look at the pandemic, that was a huge wake up call for Indonesia to realize that, hey, you're not really structured to be able to withstand a lot of shock. As in, that's a really bad thing because the pandemic may come and go, but the shock to the system will stay, right? And they have stayed. And so you're talking about issues in your law where a lot of people just simply weren't covered at the time, simply didn't have access to equitable healthcare. And that continues until today. So I'm not surprised if all these shocks have caused a lot of people to slide backwards. Now there's a lot of complaints and talks about unemployment rates. Also, Indonesia has some very strange, I would say they're unofficial regulations that a lot of private companies, for example, have maximum age of applicants. So, oh, people 27 and under only allowed to apply. And that's really strange because then what are you going to do with all of those that are not included in this equation? Are you just going to have more unemployed 29 and up? That's odd. So we do a lot of these things and we don't enforce inclusive economic policies, which in the end, say there's another shock, and there might be one, because again, we're all looking towards the US and their economic policies, right? And their interest rate, then you simply won't be as equipped to survive more and more of these issues. So I think when we're looking at for the future cabinet, really consider how are you going to make more inclusive economic policies, equitable economic policies, so that you don't have strange rules and regulations that is currently operating that actually limit how much economic growth happens. So this isn't just you're doing these things to be quote unquote nice to people. No, you need to do it so people work and they're employed and generate income, which then will boost expenditure.
Yeah, I think basically, two parts of it, right? Which is like saying that there are shocks, and then there's the fact that the work still needs to be done, right? Let To be fair, there's the shocks that have also impacted Singapore, right? So obviously, pandemic killed off like there's tourism and a bunch of industries. It was a big shock to the middle class. Then obviously there's a global economic slowdown with supply shortages. I mean, global conflict, and you have all these issues on, for example, Ukraine agricultural production, Russian oil, the US-China decoupling. So I think there's a lot of supply chain shifts as
Mhm.
well. So not easy for both Singapore and Indonesia. That caused inflation as well, right? Cost of goods went up. In the past, it used to go down. Food used to be cheaper and cheaper. Energy used to be cheaper and cheaper. And now it's at best, it's growing slower than the really rapid inflation, which obviously kills the middle class because as a middle class, you're eating soybeans and cooking oil and food, right? You know what I mean? And then obviously we had high interest rates as well because of the US and the EU, and interest rates have been high. Southeast Asia, from Thailand to Singapore to Indonesia, has been, you need to keep those interest rates high to prevent the Asian financial crisis from happening again, where money flows from our currencies to America, even though we probably don't want to have high interest rates. But so I think these shocks are applied to the whole of Southeast Asia from my perspective. So I wouldn't say it's just Indonesia on the shock side. But I think the difference that you said is that the base is different. Singapore has a lot more resilience with the social support networks, the higher GDP per capita,
Yep.
so on and so forth, the forced savings by the government and the forced savings of households kind of like create that. I mean, it's still painful, but it's not as painful as the shrinking middle class.
Yeah. I think also when we're talking about economic policies in Indonesia, the majority of movement and growth can still be seen from the large conglomerates. But again, this is back to what kind of inclusive economic policies do you have that spur the middle class, which also correlates with your banking laws, right? So, how easy is it for small companies or medium companies, not even small, let's just talk about medium companies, to take out bank loans? It's seriously difficult because bank loans, and due to Federal Reserve laws in Indonesia, they would need to maintain a higher amount of liquidity, right? Unlike, let's say, the US, so that you can avoid bank runs. They've come to a level where it's very hard to maintain and grow their businesses without access, equitable access to financing, where usually it's really only available to large conglomerates. So I think when we're thinking about economic policies, also think about how are you making it easy for businesses to operate, any business. How pro business are you? Not just pro large business, but pro small, medium size, actually MSMEs. Like, what initiatives are there to allow them to thrive? And this goes down all the way to the bottom because Indonesia is naturally decentralized. We have thousands of islands. So it's also not about just creating industries in certain islands because simply certain islands don't have as much infrastructure, for example, as Java, Bali Island, which are the most developed island, also the most densely populated. But that shouldn't stop people from growing and from thriving. If that means those areas end up having more MSMEs, then what would the government do in order to allow those MSMEs to thrive and finally grow, right? And that again goes back to how protectionist are your economic policies? Is it easy for them to get certain types of raw materials? Is it easy for them to export anything? Is it easy for them to set prices and have access to technology and Wi Fi? Those are the things that I think are actually areas of opportunity for the next cabinet, which is to truly think about equitable access and more open economic policies to allow entrepreneurs of any size, not just large conglomerates, to thrive.
I think you talked about so much important stuff, which is when we talk about, for example, borrowing, why are you borrowing? If you're talking about MSMEs and saying, hey, I want to borrow in order to increase my productive capacity, have a better income, that's, I want to say a good form of credit, but I mean, I think the goal is to generate more revenue in the future versus I think consumer credit, where if you're borrowing from future income to fund current consumption,
That's
then
different.
that's very different because you're not improving the life. Right? There's a big difference between borrowing to fund your kids' education, makes sense, versus borrowing to buy more clothes or fancy hardware. So I think there's a big piece that's pretty important. And I think government's policy is always that you need to push hard on the business lending piece. Because I think by nature, banks and finance institutions will always do the consumer one because it's kind of like a no-brainer.
Of course.
Everybody wants to borrow, buy something now and
But the
pay later.
US,
Buy now, pay later is probably like the most obvious, I don't know, value proposition. Probably worked like 5,000 years ago.
oh
Probably like,
gosh,
you
yes.
go to some caveman and you're like, hey, do you want to buy now and pay later? I was like, it would make total sense from a consumer perspective. But I think it's hard to do it. And you need a lot of government support to push capital into micro and small, medium enterprises that are not sophisticated or not thoughtful about how to do so.
Yes. And by the way, I am very aware of how challenging non performing loans are. I really am. because I am a venture capitalist and I see a lot of fintech deck. And more than that is through my Instagram platform, I do get a lot of stories on people finding it very hard to get out of predatory loans and all these debt mechanisms. So I think very, very aware of that. And the question is more then what can you do to break this cycle? Because so much of people taking on personal debt is also to fund whatever thing that they want to fund, which is not what it's used for. It's supposed to be for consumer debt because, as you said, everyone wants to go there. Everyone wants to pursue that. That seems to be an easy avenue for revenue. But again, it's about what are the safeguards we can put in place, what supportive systems and policies we can do so that the middle class continue to thrive rather than always be pulled back every time there's a shock to the system.
Yeah, so many things to talk about. And obviously, I love to poke deeper into non-performing loans. Is that a function of people just being not financially sophisticated, for example, to know what the loans are? Or is it a function that the loan terms are just too strict and or there's not enough regulation of it? What's going on there?
I think for a lot of developing economies like Indonesia, where the populace are both very digitally savvy and very digitally aware at the same time, financial literacy and education is simply not at the standard that it should be. So if you put two of those together where it's so easy to open up an app and get a loan, and I've seen a lot of people do this and go through it, when it's so easy, it becomes very hard to get out of the cycle once you're in it. And again, let's not take our financial literacy for granted because we are so privileged to even be in this situation because that means you learned it from someone. Someone taught you. The earlier, the better. But in places like Indonesia, where a lot of the wealth is also generated only in the last 30 or something years, you have that issue of financial literacy just not keeping up with the rise of digitalization and technology adoption. And that becomes very challenging. And by the way, this also is a challenge to public administrators because a lot of public administrators and decision makers simply don't have also enough digital literacy. When you have the majority of decisions being given to the hands of insert whatever political elite that's been around for 30 years or more, or 20 years or more, and they're older, and the people surrounding them, their inner circle, are also older people, and they're all of, let's say, the top 1 or 2% of the economy, then they are separated from the real issue of the populace. And therefore, they don't have enough connection with the actual problem. And so for them, they often don't see a problem until it becomes the avalanche that it is, because they only see the iceberg this entire time. Oh, that's interesting. There are apps. I'm like, well, there are millions of Indonesians currently trapped in predatory loans. Issues with online gambling is extremely prevalent in Indonesia, and it's heartbreaking. It's so heartbreaking and it's sad. So, for example, a really weird statistic is that more than 30% of people that currently are stuck with predatory loans and are just suffering under it are teachers. And what does that have to do with anything? Does it mean teachers just love buying nice stuff? No, it's because they simply started making less. So I think all of these issues, whether you call it non-performing loans, predatory loans, online gambling, all of these issues with money fall back down to the question of one, do people even feel psychologically safe and secure with the money that they have now? Do they generate enough income and feel secure enough to buy their everyday basic need? That's number one. That's the issue because you can stamp out all of these online gambling platforms all you want. But again, when people do not feel enough security and comfort with where they are in life, they might take huge risks, finally get some money, right? That's the sad reality. And then two, the question is there enough government support and equitable access for financing needs for the everyday people or for MSMEs, not just conglomerates? It's a lot of questions.
I think the crux of it is that where government comes in is that you are accepted to take more loss in the sense that if you're supporting the poor or the middle class, especially the lower middle class, then you're expected to subsidize, in other words, take a loss on some of this financing or guarantees or create a corporate slash national guarantee on some programs in order to do grants or subsidies or do subsidized interest rates effectively to help them grow to the next stage. So I think it's not an easy set of positions to be because it's hard to do.
Yeah, no, I'm not saying this is easy, nor am I saying the solutions can be had in the next 2 years. Absolutely not. But it's about putting the building blocks in place so that over time, the policies can adjust with the macros, right? So, for example, with more digitalization, what are you going to do with the rise of all these loans? And what are you going to do with the rise of even alternative assets? Because with less trust in the banking system, people might run to crypto, and they do, by the way. So then how are you going to regulate that? Because you can't just block stuff. You can't just block websites all the time because one, there's VPN, but also two, you're just addressing the wound. You're just putting a band-aid. You have to see the entire system. You have to see the entire trauma within, not just the band-aids of, oh, why are people doing online gambling? Maybe because they don't feel secure and they don't have enough money. Or like, oh, why are people so down in predatory loans? Maybe they don't have enough money to even pay for basic stuff.
And so I think in the context of this shrinking middle class, we can look at some of these policies that we discussed before in the past episodes. We discussed, for example, the decision to increase the debt to GDP ratio, to increase investments. We talked about the 200% tariffs on Chinese imports, but also the Chinese infrastructure spending in Jakarta and potentially Bali as well. How do you feel about that set of, I guess, administrative or government measures?
Again, unfortunately, we have a tendency to be reactive rather than proactive. Tariffs, all of these things are in the end, they can end up being a short to middle term solution. But the real question then is your country friendly to businesses? Is your country friendly to people trying to make a business? And when I say the word business, unfortunately, there's an association in Indonesia. Oh, you have a business. That means you must be top 1%. But actually, a business can be anyone. You can be a one person business selling something on Shopee. And the fact that the policies have been so skewed towards the very small slice of conglomerate companies is an issue because business should feel doable for the average person. But then again, without equitable access to all of these things, including at the baseline is education and the ability to know you can make a business, that's already a problem. So we're not even talking about equitable access to financing tools if the country also cannot address the basic issue of just education. And so when thinking about the future, again, this is a challenge for the administration to think about how are you trying to solve your education problems? Does this mean there should be more policies on trade schools? Does this mean there should be more policies on maybe not a traditional four-year university? Maybe it's something that's more skill-based education. Or is it the kind of education where there are more access to alternative ways of learning? I don't know. But these are actually areas of opportunity of saying, hey, maybe the way we've been doing things now isn't the best, that maybe we could move forward. Because the thing is, when people say, oh, other countries haven't done it before, we can't do it, I'd like to call BS on that because lots of countries outside of the US, the UK, and the EU have made big progress on their own before other countries. For example, Indonesia is actually one of those countries that have had paid first day of menstrual leave. We've had this policy since the late 40s or 50s because our first labor minister was a woman. You can be the first in something. And so I think that is where also as a populace, Indonesians can ask for more. And what made me very hopeful is that we did. We asked for more only a month ago, where we went down to the streets and said, no, you are not going to mess around with the Constitution even more. This is what we want. That was actually a signal that the Indonesian middle class is now ready to say something in politics and make their voices heard, which is very powerful and should be a lesson also for other countries.
When we think about this, what do you think are the, let's say, wish list, right? The magic wand. My daughters were watching Cinderella a little bit, the fairy godmother, the little, and
Oh,
then,
I love that.
turning a pumpkin into a carriage. If you had a magic wand, what would be the three things that you would
Oh,
transform?
me. Oh my gosh, if it's me. First things first is basic needs. That's just 100% number one. Basic needs. So nutrition, housing, and to be honest, clean air. Basically, people where if you live, you won't end up with higher healthcare costs to be a basic need. Like that should be basic need. And then second is education because that's the building block of society, right? A healthy society. So the first one, nutrition, healthcare, housing, healthy air, the environment. Then second is education. And then the third would be economic policies, inclusive economic policies, which is how are you going to make things more equitable for small, medium businesses, including micro businesses? How are you going to allow more women to participate in the economy and not just devalue the care economy? These are really big questions, right? And right now, for example, Indonesia doesn't have an equal pay act, unlike Qatar. So stuff like that we have to think about for our future. How are you going to make it more inclusive and equitable? Not because you're being quote unquote so nice and permissive. No, it's because that's what you need to have more participation. Don't you want more participation? Because the more you divide things up and create hierarchies, I hate to say it, that's how you create more graphs, more issues of corruption in public administration. And that's also how you give the wrong incentives to the populace. And what you end up having is a societally disruptive force whenever another shock comes to the system. So that wasn't our last pandemic, nor is this our last economic crisis in the future. So what are you going to do to create a stable society?
Yeah, definitely. On that note, I think that's a good way to wrap things up. And so thank you so much for sharing about what your magic wand policies will be.
Oh my gosh, don't hold me up to that.
I mean, nobody's expecting you to do it yourself, Gita.
That's true. It better. I don't even work there.
All right, peace out.
Thank you. Peace.
Thank you for listening to Brave. If you enjoyed this episode, please share the podcast with your friends and colleagues. We would also appreciate you leaving a rating or review. Head over to www.bravesea.com for member content, resources, and community. Stay well and stay brave.